I want to talk to you about my book today, and there were 3 case studies for my book, and I'm going to focus on the last case study, which is the Indo-Chinese Women's Conferences. These were conferences that were held in Vancouver and in Toronto in 1971, and about 1,000 women attended these conferences, mostly from the United States, but also from Canada, and then there were also representatives from South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and Laos. So it was really an expression of a global women's peace movement. So I want to talk about, particularly, how Asian American women figured into that broader political movement. And I'll mention these themes of hypervisibility and invisibility in just a minute. I don't know how familiar people are with the Vietnam War, so I'm just going to give a quick and dirty overview. The way we can think about the Vietnam War, and there's multiple ways to think about it, but one way we could think about it was whether we could think about the war as a movement against anti-colonialism, or you can think about it as a war against anti-communism. And certainly from the United States perspective, in the context of the Cold War, the US was thinking that it was trying to stop the communist dominoes, it was trying to prevent the spread of communism, and that's why it was invested in the war. From the perspective of many of the people in Vietnam, this was a movement to gain national independence. The Vietnam War that we call it was actually, from their perspective, the second Indochina War. The first Indochina War occurred after World War II, when Vietnamese were trying to overthrow the French and regain national independence. And after a 9-year war, there was an agreement, a Geneva Accord, in which Vietnam would be divided between the North and South temporarily. Within 2 years' time, there would be a national election, and at that point, the country would be unified. The United States was very concerned that if Vietnam actually had an election, that the communist leader Ho Chi Minh would actually win the election. So the United States worked with and helped develop a South Vietnamese government to prevent that national election from happening. Eventually, the United States ended up committing not just political support, economic support, but also military support. And this graphic just tells you a few of the kind of really interesting key aspects about the war. One thing that I think is really striking is that the total number of bombs that were dropped on Vietnam, which is a relatively small country, the total number of bombs that were dropped in Vietnam were 3 times the amount of bombs used during World War II. So you can imagine the world theater, the war theater during World War II. It was Africa, it was the Pacific, it was Asia, it was Europe. All those theaters, all the amount of bombs that were dropped during that time period, if you triple that, that's how many bombs were dropped in Vietnam. In addition, twice as many bombs were dropped in the South, which is what the United States was allied with. There's a famous quote by a US military officer, and he said that in order to save it, we had to destroy it. He was talking about a village. He said in order to save that village from communism, we had to destroy the village. But that quote really encapsulates the absolute violence of the war, not just in terms of conventional weaponry, but also chemical weapons, the use of napalm, the use of Agent Orange. I just visited Vietnam in February, January this year. It was the 40th anniversary of the Paris peace talks, and you can still see the remnants in terms of the landscape and on the people. So we visited one location. They told us not to wander off the path because it had just recently rained. And when it rains, all these unexploded bombs might potentially come to the surface. There's still children who get maimed, and even older people get maimed when they just reach out for shiny objects in the landscape around them. So all those bombs that were dropped, and all of them exploded and continue to be in the landscape. Also, we visited schools for children who have suffered the after effects of Agent Orange. These are people who were born 3 to 4 generations after the war. But those toxins stay in the water, they stay in the food, and they are in people's bodies. So one of the schools that we visited, the children were just great. They sang Gangnam Style to us. They were just fun and exuberant. But they also are suffering from physical and mental disabilities because of their exposure to Agent Orange. And I felt incredibly horrible because they wouldn't be in that school if the United States had not conducted the war that it did. Just one other statistic that I think is very interesting, that when the United States started the war, it was also starting a widespread social agenda to eradicate poverty. It's called the War on Poverty, and they would fund programs like Head Start and fund other programs to say, as a country, we are wealthy enough that we can alleviate poverty for everybody. So during that time, the United States was spending about less than $2 billion a year on the war on poverty. At the same time, it was spending about $2 billion a month on the war in Vietnam. And over time, it was not sustainable to both fight the war in Vietnam and fight the war on poverty. So this just gives you a background of the war. What I'm interested in the context of war, is how do people foster a sense of internationalism? That is, how do they develop a sense of political communion across national boundaries? If you think about wartime, the norm is hyper-patriotism. The media, the government, it's trying to foster people's allegiance to their country. So I'm interested in how do people during times of war look beyond that? How do they develop political allegiance beyond the nation? And I just want to take as a starting point a quote by Benedict Anderson, who's a theorist of the nation. The nation is as an imagination, because all communities larger than primordial villages of face-to-face contact will never know most of their fellow members, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. So he's saying that we can't possibly know everybody who lives in this country, but we have a sense that we have a connection to each other, right? This kind of imagined connection. Because hyper-patriotism is such a norm during the war, I'm interested in the ways in which people travel beyond the nation, the face-to-face contact they have with people outside the United States, and how those face-to-face contacts then foster a different type of political sensibility. The other main idea that I'm playing around with in my book is a concept I'm proposing called radical Orientalism. And I'll talk about it in just a minute. But first I want to talk about Orientalism. A quote by Edward Said. The Orient was almost a European invention and had been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories and landscapes, remarkable experiences. In addition, the Orient has helped to define Europe, or the West, as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. Just a few things I want to highlight from this quote. First, that Western understandings of the East, Western understandings of the Orient, are not actually what exists there, but it's rather a projection. That projection, the next point, is that it's a dichotomy between the East and the West. The West represents rationality, it represents science, it represents modernity. The East represents the opposite of that. It represents fanaticism, it represents religion, right? Backwardness, being ahistorical. There's a dichotomy between the two, and usually the West is on top and the East is on the bottom. And the third point is that the system of Orientalism not only defines the Orient in relation to the West, but that dichotomy also defines the West itself. And finally, the fourth point I want to emphasize here is that dichotomization, that process of Orientalization, occurs through a process of colonization. So I'm interested in people who are trying to challenge colonization. They're trying to challenge these classical understandings of the Orient, classical understandings of Orientalism. And in return, they are then in turn reinforcing a binary between the East and the West. In the context of the 60s, 70s, there's a critique of the United States as being imperialist, as being racist, as being sexist. And the activists who are articulating those critiques are then also turning to decolonizing Asia for political inspiration. They are looking to them to see, well, what's possible politically if we don't accept these socialism systematic hierarchy. So those are kind of the big ideas. I want to now turn to my particular example of the Indo-Chinese Women's Conferences. I mentioned before how it's an example of ways in which women can come across national boundaries and advocate for peace. This process was particularly important because the existing historiography tends to write the anti-war movement as a very male movement. This is a slogan that was articulated at that time that reinforces that perception. Women say yes to men who say no. What do you think that might mean? So men say no to the draft, men say no to the war. They are the ones who are going to take a political stance and not fight the war. What women offer to these men is their sexual availability. Right? So this slogan reinforces the idea that men are the political actors and women are just sort of sexual partners to the real political actors. So what I want to highlight instead is that the anti-war movement was not just encapsulated in this quote, but rather there was a diversity and there's a persistence of women's peace activism that ranged across chronological period, that ranged across generations, that ranged across political ideologies. I want to argue that within this women's peace movement, that there tended to coexist both a feminist Orientalism and a radical Orientalism. What do I mean by feminist Orientalism? People like Lila Roop have argued that Western activists have tended to look on non-Western women as the ultimate victims. They are victims of their own culture. Their cultures are so patriarchal that women from the West have to rescue these individuals. Right? It's kind of a politics of rescue. Now, on one hand, that attitude existed, such that women from the West wanted to rescue these poor Vietnamese women who were under the duress of war. On the other hand, there was also the sense that they want to turn to the same Vietnamese women for political instruction. That these women are no longer the victims, they're no longer the abject, but instead they are models of heroic resistance. So just to give you an example of this politics of rescue versus the politics of revolutionary heroism, this is a mother and child image, and I tend to call this the Vietnamese Madonna. This image is from a women's organization, Women's Strike for Peace, middle class, predominantly white, women's organization that was against war, that was against nuclear proliferation. And in this image, you see this utterly victimized woman. She barely looks like she has any energy. Right? She's holding this child, and the child is looking directly at us. And I think the message is saying, let's save the child, because this woman can't really do it herself. You can even see Western angels coming in, swooping in, and helping her. Now contrast that with another image of a mother and child. This is an image that appeared in an Asian American publication, Ghidra, but it also circulated more widely in the Black Panther newspapers. It circulated more widely in activist publication. And even if it was not exactly this image, a version of this image circulated. So you have a peasant woman, again with a child. In the other hand, she's got an AK-47, right? She's not, she looks perfectly capable of defending herself. There's not a contradiction between her being a mother and also being a revolutionary. So again, both of these images circulated during that time period, and I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between these two and the tensions between the two. Another point I want to emphasize in my talk is the ways in which Asia was not just acted upon, but that women of color in the United States who thought of themselves as third world women were also historical agents. So both rethinking our historical actors in terms of Asian women as well as Asian American women. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I'm really interested in how both these groups are articulating a critique of colonization as well as militarism. And I want to talk about how, on the one hand, Asian women, especially Vietnamese women, during this time period were particularly hypervisible. I mentioned both these images, and especially the latter, circulated quite broadly. Although I think the historiography has not quite acknowledged that. Right? We think about political icons from that time period. We might think about Malcolm X, we might think about Martin Luther King, maybe Che Guevara, but we don't really think about Asian women, especially Vietnamese women, as political icons. In contrast to that hypervisibility, there's an invisibility of Asian American activists, especially Asian American female activists. Not only is the emergence of the model minority myth during the mid-60s, around the time of the war, but there's also, in particular for women, there's a sense that they themselves are either hypersexualized or hypersubmissive. And so this type of work, I think, will help challenge those type of perceptions.